Hello. Hey, people are already here. I am sorry that I'm a little bit late. Uh, my wound was acting up a little bit, so I had to take care of that. Guys, we are 13 weeks out from surgery, and it is still such a joy, let me tell you. Hello, hello, hello. I see several people already here. That's exciting. Hi, guys. Welcome, welcome. I have a set topic for this evening, which I already talked a little bit about over on Instagram, but before we dive fully into that, we'll just chat here for a minute. I'm going to give you fair warning, guys. This is going to be a little heavier version of live stream tonight, but we're living in heavy times, so that's kind of just part of it. Hello. Lots of highs all around. Yes, books and baking. This is exactly what we'll be getting into a little bit here. So, trying to think of some lighter things before we fully just dive into this. What can I tell you? My kitties are adorable. Today, my cleaning service came, which was exciting. I was happy to see them. It'd been a few months, so chatted with them, but they had not been here since the kitties had been here, and the kitties were absolutely terrified of like the vacuum and all of that. So it took most of the day for them to venture back out, but they were mildly to very traumatized by that entire experience. So they've come back out. They're snuggled up together now on my reading chair because they like to sleep there. I think it's because it smells like me. Any other light things I can think of before we get into this? Reading. I've been comfort reading. I'm sure many people have been. Yesterday, I finished up Undercurrents by Nora Roberts, which was her standalone thriller last year. That wasn't very much of a thriller, which was okay. I still liked it. And then I dove right on into Hideaway, which is the one that just came out from her, which is also sort of like a romantic suspensey thing. And so far, it's real good. Nora Roberts' books are just like a warm blanket of love. So I enjoy those. Okay, I think that's all I got in terms of lighter vamping. So this is like, I was texting with one of my best friends earlier, and I was like, I feel like we're living through a lesson plan for AP US history right now. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and it's really overwhelming, I think. Like, some of this I just want to name. Like, I think it's really overwhelming to see just like awful things happening to fellow human beings in general. Like, that's always hard. It's also hard to know that that's a product of a system that you are a part of but feel very powerless to change. It makes me feel like, honestly, how I feel whenever I see, like, there's been another mass shooting in the US. I remember when I was in high school, because like I was in high school when that started to be a thing, and thinking, well, like, can't the grown-ups just take care of this? Like, why can't the grown-ups fix this? Something to that effect. And now that I am the grown-up, it makes me feel so powerless because I feel like I should be able to fix it. And I think a lot of people feel that way. It's like, individually, we want to do things, and it's very hard because individually it's hard to affect change. However, what does change is hearts and minds driving culture, and because of that, top-down change. Like, those are the two things that lead to the world that we want to see. And I can't do much about top-down change, and Lord knows there's plenty of people trying to work on that. But something that we can all do is work to change hearts and minds in ourselves and in the people around us. So with that in mind, one of the main things coming out of everything that is happening right now in terms of what's going on with all of the rioting and all the protesting here in the US, that comes out of hundreds of years of oppression, is one of the things I've seen Black content creators and Black people who I follow on social media talking about is it is a burden to expect that Black people need to educate non-Black people about what this is like on a day-to-day basis, what this experience right now is like for people, etc. So one small thing I can do, aside from donating and trying to amplify voices in other ways, is be a non-Black person trying to help other non-Black people educate themselves to the extent possible that we can. Yeah, like what Stephanie said, we all want resources to self-educate. And I don't think much of what I'm going to share is going to be revolutionary if this is a topic that you're already interested in. But I thought this is a book channel. What I can do is talk about books on this topic that I have enjoyed over the years. Why I think that they work in terms of like as a good entry point to educate ourselves on macro systems of oppression against Black people in the US in particular. And things that I'm reading right now, things that I want to read next, just basically making that available. Reading Stamped from the Beginning. Yes, that's going to be one of the ones we talk about. I think that's one of the main ones I want to recommend to people because I think it's just really excellent. Educating ourselves. Francina Simone, who, if you don't know, is a part of the BookTube community, and she's also an author. So, okay, I made notes for this because also something I want to, like, part of the other reason I'm doing this is that I think that people who, like white people definitely, but just generally people who are not Black, it is hard. I think that there's this feeling that we have to know exactly what to say and we have to get everything exactly right. And while, of course, like the entire point of this is we should educate ourselves so that we are speaking from a place of being informed, part of what we have to do is say something and acknowledge, like, we're not always going to get it right, and being humble and open to correction when we don't get it right. I think that there's this real fear of, if I say something wrong, I'm going to be labeled as X. And I think that fear keeps people from using their voice in a way that is constructive. So I did make some notes because I share that fear, and I want to model having that fear, but working through it, and being humble and saying, like, here's how I came to realize that I had a real gap in my knowledge about a piece of the world around me. And here's what I did to try to educate myself. So I was watching a video, and I think I put it already in the description box, from a channel called Mama Dr. Jones. By the way, I don't know if other people like this. I really like doctors on YouTube. I like that content. And Mama Dr. Jones is an OBGYN. And she did a video, I think yesterday or the day before, about disparities in access to healthcare for Black Americans versus non-Black Americans. I thought it was really interesting. Not necessarily stuff that was like revolutionary that I'd never heard before, but I think it was a video that was very well done. And I really liked the beginning of what she said. So I wrote it out because I was like, okay, this is a good summary of kind of like where I'm coming from in this. So just sort of as a place so you guys kind of know the context of where I'm coming from. What she said was, Black Lives Matter, and if you are working against that movement, you are part of the problem. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, there are countless others. These people and their lives and what happened to them matters. She made a couple of statements on Instagram, and in response, I've gotten threat messages along the lines of, "Don't you care about the looting?" I care more about these people's lives. Riots are not the goal of a protest, but they are what happens when you have tried to peacefully protest for so long and had no improvement in what you are protesting. We have watched for years as our Black communities have peacefully protested. We've idly stood by as others told them that their protesting was wrong. In 2013, when the Black Lives Matter movement started, that hashtag was immediately hijacked and twisted by other people who were completely tone deaf, specifically to minimize the voices of that movement. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee and peacefully, quietly protested, he was told that it was wrong. He was called names by the President of the United States. These are peaceful protests, and there are countless others. Of course, I don't condone violence, and I don't condone looting or burning property, but I care more about the voices that need to be heard and the lives that are being lost. Not to mention really good evidence that most of these riots are not even being started by the peaceful protesters to begin with. So if you're focused on that part of this situation, you might be contributing to minimizing the voices that need to be heard. I would editorialize to say you are almost certainly contributing to that. You are free, and I encourage you to discuss in the comments, but I will not tolerate any hatred in any form. I'm obviously white. I do not understand racism from a personal standpoint, and nothing I say in this video should be interpreted as me pretending that I do. We have a requirement to understand that racism comes in many forms and that nobody is immune to racism and prejudice. Our goal as individuals should be not to proclaim or prove that we are not racist or that we can't have racist intentions. It should be to self-reflect, discuss, and be aware enough of that possibility so that we can acknowledge that and make improvements moving forward. That is just my personal opinion on this topic. So I just really I thought she summed that up more succinctly than I would if I had tried to ramble, but just basically as a preface to say, if somebody wants to argue about if looting's wrong, that's dumb. I don't think anybody, I don't think reasonable people are arguing that it's right. I think that there's very good evidence to say that that is not, for the majority, happening from peaceful protesters. And basically just that, I am not Black. This is not me speaking from my personal experience. I am white, and I am a white person who wants to be an ally, and over the years has tried to educate myself increasingly so that I can be a better ally. And that is where kind of the spirit of where this is coming from. Anne-Marie, yes, educating ourselves is really important. And as a Canadian wrestling with our own racist history and society and seeking out Canadian resources and media has been something I'm trying to do. Yeah, it was really interesting living in Canada versus the US and seeing kind of the different approaches to racist histories. I think at least in Canada, there's an ability to name it in a way that in the US we're still catching up with. Though I will say it was very interesting, at least in the part of Canada I was living in. I do think a lot of Canadians I encountered had this assumption that they did not have racist tendencies towards Black people, which I can tell you is not true. I observed it. So I think every culture has its blind spots, and that means that we all have to work on educating ourselves for our own context. There are so many great Black-owned bookstores. Loyalty Books and Mahogany Books both have great online portals. Yes, there's a few Instagram stories, images or infographics I've seen going around that have a full listing of a bunch of different Black-owned bookstores. So if you're a bookish person in the community, that may be a good place to look. Mama Dr. Jones is great. I really, really enjoy her content. Even though I am not a mama, I just enjoy her content. I always enjoy people reacting to shows about their profession and talking about how they're not accurate. I just enjoy that. Yep. There are Black-owned bookstores in Tulsa. This one's called Fulton Street. Having historical context is key. It's frustrating when our experiences in this country are compared to other minority groups as a way to dismiss systematic racism. Yes. And that's the thing. I mean, it's not a good thing. There is racism against every minority race in the US, there is, but it takes different forms. And I think it's important to be aware of and think about in this moment at least, the specific forms of racism against Black people. Just the same way that I think in May, but also before, because of the coronavirus and the racism that Chinese and just generally Asian Americans were experiencing, that was an important moment to talk about that kind of flavor of racism. Okay, the ones Ursula mentioned earlier were both from DC. Yeah, I think Canadians, and I understand how Canadians end up with this narrative, because I do think it's something that's at least openly acknowledged in Canada. To a degree, it is not in the US, but just because something is acknowledged doesn't mean that it's gone. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how this topic became important or interesting to me. And I'm going to do my very best not to cry, guys, because we will get to it, but white woman tears are a problem. But just so you know, I am a Cancer sun, so I'm an emotional ass bitch. And I'm an Enneagram 1, which means like one of my core principles is justice. So like this hits me in my feelings, but I am going to do my very best not to cry talking about this. So if you had asked me growing up if I was racist, or if I thought racism was wrong, if I, would want to be an ally to Black people in my community, I'm sure I would have said yes, because I have parents who are, especially from being from the South, are pretty progressive. And specifically my dad, one of the only times I've ever seen him cry was my roommate in college was Black, and I just hadn't come up, so he didn't know that. And when I came home from school after he met her, he cried because he was like, I'm just so glad that you didn't feel like you had to mention that to me, because it makes me feel like I at least somewhat successfully didn't impart what I grew up with to you. So, I definitely had parents who cared about trying for me to not, inherit that part of the culture that frankly is just a part of being in America. But there's, we're all still privileged white people and we have blind spots. So I don't think that I was ever somebody who had active malice against non-white people, but you are a product of your environment. And I think I had a lot of very benign or well-meaning racist assumptions. And something that, I could give there was a whole journey, but the thing that was really pivotal to me realizing like, oh, I do not understand something fundamental about the way that race works in America was what happened with Trayvon Martin. When that happened, that was just like, it blew my mind that even could happen to a child walking in his own neighborhood. And that we had, at that time, I guess camera phones or like being able to film things was not as ubiquitous, but we had these 911 tapes, and it was just so clear, like crystal clear to me what happened. It was crystal clear, I think, to anybody with good sense. And I was so upset, but I was also just like, okay, like justice is going to be served here. And at the time, the podcast, like one of my favorite podcasts that I don't really listen to anymore, but at the time I loved, was called The Read. And that podcast actually really opened my perspectives up in terms of like LGBTQIA plus issues and Black issues. And that was a great podcast in terms of like intersectionality there. But they just consistently were like, well, we know he's not going to go to jail. And I was like, no, like he is, like, we have proof it's going to happen. And it like really, it almost like bothered me that they just assumed that it wasn't going to happen. And then when that man, I don't even want to say his name because he doesn't deserve to have his name said, was acquitted, I was devastated and shocked. And it really made me step back and think like, okay, they were so sure that he was not going to go to jail. Why was that? And like, what is it about this bigger picture that I'm not seeing that made it so obvious to them that justice was not going to be served? And so obvious to me that it was, and like, why was I so wrong about my assumptions about the way that this was going to work? And so from there, I was going to grad school at the time when I was studying religion. So like, I wanted to start reading basically like some Black theology, which was very interesting. We can talk about that. One of my professors specialized in the work of Martin Luther King Jr., like his theological writings. So we read a lot of that. I did some papers about like the implicit theology of Beyonce in her visual album. So I got to read some stuff about like intersectional feminism. So like that was the beginning of me like starting to read about some of that stuff. And then when I returned to the States, it was 2015. And so we were in the 2016 election cycle, and watching the amount of hate ramp up, especially coming back to the South, watching that escalate, I think again was another kind of aha moment to me of like, I need to continue to dig into this, because like this is just so this hate is so ingrained in our system and so ingrained in our culture, and I alone can't change it, but at a minimum I can understand it, and I can let that inform the way that I see the world. I remember we used to talk about that, or I talked about this with my Sunday schoolers back when I taught Sunday school, that there's three kinds of belief. There's like belief of the heart, which is emotional. And in this case, like I have this feeling of like, okay, people should be treated fairly, and like, I don't want to see people hurt. Like that's like an emotional level belief of like, that's a core value. You have belief of the head, of something that you cognitively know and say. So like, okay, like, you know, under the law, we are all supposed to have equal rights. And if people are not getting those, then that's wrong. So like, that's sort of a cognitive level belief. But then you also have gut belief, and that is more just sort of like your instinctual interpretation of how you see the world around you. And that was what I realized I was missing, of like, okay, at an instinctual level, I don't really believe that our culture and government is as racist as it is. So I need to educate myself so that I can catch up my heart and head belief to that kind of like gut belief, or I guess reverse of that. So that's kind of how I came to be interested in this. And I do think that reading more and more has really helped me transfer my heart and my head belief to a gut level, systematic or like structural understanding of what is going on. I'm careful what I say until I understand how to say it without sounding uneducated. And I think that it's good and bad. Like I share that. You can tell I wrote out things that I wanted to talk about. I made sure I had my list of books I wanted to talk about. I do want to be careful, because I don't want to, you know, kind of like, what is it in medicine, or I forget what field, the motto, do no harm. I don't want to make things worse. But at the same time, I am a white person with some small amount of a platform. And if I don't say something, that doesn't sit right with me. Like whatever little ability I have to help get good information out, I want to do that. So I totally understand that. But I also think, especially to my fellow white people, like we have to start being willing to say something and risk sounding uneducated or risk getting it wrong, because we are the ones with the structural power. All I can say is I'm Black and I'm tired. I think that's fair. That is beyond fair. When I was in high school in the 80s, racism was treated like something fixed in 1964, which was also treated like ancient history. Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest kind of like hurdles to overcome, and part of why reading up on this subject and educating ourselves is so important, because I do think that tends to be the narrative of, oh, there were, you know, yeah, there were like racists back then, but we're good now. You know, the classic, like, well, Barack Obama was president, or Oprah Winfrey is a billionaire. Like, that means racism is done. That's individual prosperity is not enough to fix entire structures of oppression. And also 1964, like my parents both remember having their schools forcibly integrated. Like it is within living memory. It's not like that was all that long ago. Sorry. Oh yeah. I love your I just love your avatar. Every time I say it, it makes me happy. Okay, sorry. Sorry if I missed this, but where and what did you study for grad school? So I went to grad school in Vancouver, and I studied religion. My focus was in like women's studies, popular literature, and Christianity. Basically, I got a degree that let me kind of decide what I wanted to study when I picked classes to let me write the papers I was interested in writing at that time. So that was the joy of it. Okay. So let's get to the books. That was what I promised. So like, let's dive into that. I want to start, let's see, where did I start here? Okay, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. If you are a regular watcher of my channel, you know that this is one of my all-time favorite books. Like, I could even divorce this from the actual subject matter and just say, like, as a history of ideas, this is just an excellent book. But specifically, this is a book that outlines the history of racist ideas in America, where they come from, and how they have morphed and evolved over time. I think that this book is a really cogent argument for how racism is embedded just like intrinsically in our society. And like, I think what he does a really good job of is showing how the same ideas have popped up over and over and over again throughout US history. I think one of the most pernicious ones, and he kind of shows the evolution of this, is this idea of respectability politics. So I think that that's particularly a really helpful conversation. I think especially if you are not a Black person, but really if you're a white person, I think that this is one of the most hard to acknowledge and say versions of racism that is very common in the US, which is this idea of because the US is so centered on ideas of individual responsibility, there's this huge tendency to say like, okay, like maybe the systems are racist, but you're an individual, you can overcome it as long as you are good enough, you know, you'll be fine. I think the recent awful example of the woman in Central Park calling the police on a Black man who was bird watching is a great example of how that it doesn't matter. You can't be respectable enough to avoid racism in America. He was literally like a Harvard grad, you know, like an upstanding member of his community in every possible way, but that didn't matter. In that moment, she was a white woman using her power against a Black man in a way that she knew would hurt him. So that idea in particular, I think is really hard to overcome. And I think this book does a great job of explaining several different racist threads throughout US history, but particularly that one, and really making a compelling argument of why it is so harmful. Yes, UBC. I lived in West Point Grey, so right there, kind of behind that, was it a Safeway? Behind the grocery store. Yes. Okay, Bethany, yes, I was about to give a shout out to this version as well, based on the strength of your recommendation. So I have not read this version Bethany's mentioning, which is Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You with Jason Reynolds. Like she said, it's a YA version, so it's a simplified and shorter history. And Bethany, I think you said you listened to this on audio, so I think we can recommend it on audio. I recommend Stamped from the Beginning, but the original one on audio for sure. But if you're looking for a shorter version of the same ideas, if you're not a big history nerd and want to get it a little bit more direct, there you go. That's the sub recommendation there. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of what, the more you read in this area, what Holly has said here, the more you read about this, the more it becomes, like I said, a gut level understanding of like, oh, it's everywhere. And it's just harder and harder to kind of not see it once you've had it pointed out to you. So that is one of the main ones I recommend. The second one I would want to recommend is a book called White Fragility by Robyn DiAngelo. Now, I want to say Robyn DiAngelo is not Black. So take that into account. But what Robyn DiAngelo does is she spends her life she's a white woman talking to other white women about or not white women, just white people, about this idea of white fragility and how white people being so afraid of being labeled as racist or saying the wrong thing or whatever makes it so we are just unable to allow a conversation about race to bubble up because we feel so defensive about it. And I think she does a really good job of explaining in very relatable terms why we feel that way as white people and how to get over it so that we can be allies and allow the conversations that need to happen about race to happen. So I think, again, it's not from a Black author, but I think it is written specifically to a white audience in a way that I think is really relatable, makes a lot of sense, and is something a lot of people can connect with. So that would be my second recommendation for sure. Okay, yeah, Bethany says that Jason does the audio, and she did like it. A fiction recommendation is Pride by E.B. Zaboy. I have not read this, but I think I've heard pretty much nothing but great things about it. So if you're looking for a fiction recommendation, there's one that I know a lot of people love. I learned a lot more on my own and doing my own research than I ever learned in our school system. Yeah, and I do think that over time it's getting better because I think that there's an increasing awareness of how much was omitted, at least in my generation's learning about our history specifically with respect to Black people and with Native people. I remember being well into college when I finally realized that okay, everything I was taught about Indigenous people in the US, that was all genocide. Oh, okay. Well, I never thought about it this way before. And that was a real, I remember almost feeling betrayed of well, wait, this whole narrative that I've been taught, it just became so clear to me, oh, well, you've completely omitted a huge piece of what the real story here is. So it, sadly, I hope over time that becomes less and less necessary. But as things stand right now, a lot of this, unfortunately, is incumbent upon us to seek out as adults or as teens to educate ourselves. Yeah, so Sanika says, I would recommend everyone to read Malcolm X and also to read about what MLK says in his letters and speeches, since people like to whitewash him and reduce him to I have a dream speech. I want to second both those things. I don't think I have it on my TBR this year, but I think I think I'm hoping to get that next year. The Autobiography of Malcolm X as a nonfiction classic. And people want to use MLK for all kinds of things. If you start actually reading his theology, it is hella radical. Not only with respect to race, but also with respect to class. Yeah. I'll just commend you to go read, reading, I don't have this on this list. Reading primary source accounts is really helpful, I think, in this, in terms of reading history, reading what people actually said themselves in their own words, I think is really powerful. Okay, so I talked about white fragility. Another one that I think goes along, that pairs really well with white fragility, and I would actually recommend that they be read together, is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeomo Oluo, which is the same book project, the same kind of project as white fragility, but it is coming from the perspective of a Black woman. And I think it addresses intersectionality really well. And I think because Oluo is biracial, her mother is white, she also does a really good job of understanding and speaking to non-Black audiences in a way that I think really connects. And again, it's not necessarily her responsibility to do that, but I do think that if you are coming from a perspective of being white, her willingness to speak on that level is very helpful. Let's see. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, but it is needed in life to lift the veil from our white people's eyes. Yeah. Yep. You can't unsee it. And yes, the white version of history, that's dominant narrative in school. Dominant school narrative is oof. Bethany recommends Riot Baby by Tochi Onyebuchi. Is a speculative novella that deals with race in the criminal justice system and in prison. Another good fiction rec there. Let's see. Yeah, I will say, I think part of the conversation, you can't persuade somebody who doesn't want to be persuaded. That's like just the black bottom line, period, done. So I think part of what white people who want to be allies to marginalized communities, one of the number one things that we can do is in communities where we already have trusting relationships, to challenge other white people about their assumptions and about what they feel okay to say in private. I find that pointed sarcasm is very helpful. I've several times had people use quotations around Black Lives Matter as if it was kind of a joke. And I kind of turn it around and say, oh, oppression of an underclass, hilarious. They get the point. They are the ones who look dumb. Here's the thing. If you point it out in a crowd, it's uncomfortable. And people may look at you differently. But I'm okay with people looking at me differently if by pointing out somebody else's racist jokes or assumptions makes me whatever, unsafe, uncool, whatever. I can't change someone's mind who doesn't want to have their mind changed, but I can help people see where they are, where they have blind spots. And it can go one of two ways. It can send someone further down a path of having racist attitudes, or it can make them self-reflect. Sadly, I think it does not make many people self-reflect, but it will make some people self-reflect. And if we create a world where white people do not allow tacit racism to happen in front of them, that's not violent, but is perpetuating these ingrained thought patterns, that is slowly over time how you make cultural change. And it makes family barbecues real fun. Okay, so we talked about, so you want to talk about race. Oh, the other one I wanted to mention is another one by Ibram X. Kendi, which is called How to Be an Anti-Racist. That was his memoir last year, but it also specifically is, again, talking to people who want to be not just not racist, but specifically anti-racist, which is kind of what I was just talking about. Like, it's not enough to say, like, well, I don't want to be a racist person. That's passive, and it allows racism to continue to flourish. We have to become, all of us, people who, in whatever way in our daily life as possible, are anti-racist, and having active saying, like, it's not just, it's not apophatic. It's not saying I don't want to be this. It's saying I do want to be this. And what I want to be is anti-racist. And how can I educate myself, prepare myself to support and be an ally in my daily life. So I thought that was a really powerful memoir. He's a very beautiful writer. And I think he has a kind of prophetic vision, or kind of like prophetic quality that is very good for like casting vision. Maybe that's a better word, vision casting. I think he does a really good job with that. from Octopus Books, How to Be an Anti-Racist, White Fragility, and Hood Feminism. Yeah. The Autobiography of Malcolm X is one of the best books I've ever read. Highly recommended. I'm excited. Also, it was written by Alex Haley, who is from Knoxville, which is where I'm from. And there's this big statue to him at the University of Tennessee Library. So just like double interest there. That's one I keep meaning to get to. Growing up in the South Dakota City School, where they have friends, many races, classes, religions, and discuss issues between each other and just accept each other. So great to see. I mean, that is a huge piece of it, is just like socialization to people who look different from you and have different maybe experiences or religion or whatever. I think, yeah, that's another huge piece of how the culture changes, which changes hearts and minds. And that is what actually enacts real change. Our local indie did a blog post on anti-racism books. And when a friend of mine went to buy one a day or two later, they were already completely sold out. Yeah, I've seen so many great postings from my local independent bookstores, but just like generally, I think people are trying to champion these voices and you know, now, if not now, when, right? My go-to when someone says some stupid joke is to act all confused and ask them to explain what they mean. That usually shuts them up. Yes, I've done that too. That is another very effective strategy. Pointed sarcasm or like, can you explain why that's funny? Is a quick way to point out somebody's racism to them, basically. Yeah, and that's the other, it's hard. I think that's the other thing that keeps white people from, like, I went back and forth if I should even do this, and I was like, no, like, something that Black creators and Black people who are speaking about this online right now are saying is like, educate yourself. Don't expect me to educate you. So like, this is something I can do. This isn't about me though. Like, I'm trying to share my story to make, I think that there's this feeling that we all have to come out of the womb being perfectly educated about something and perfectly enlightened. And that's just not how that's not how life works. And so like, we all have a journey to educate ourselves. We all have a journey to humble ourselves and say like, maybe I'm not seeing everything correctly here. And so, yeah, I mean, like, I hope that this is like one of my biggest fears. Like, I don't want to make it about me. But I also feel like we have, like, white people we have to start saying things and acting. Women have the right to vote today because men gave them that right. That's something I don't like and something that's gross, but it's a reality. People who have power are the only people who can grant power. There's an essay, a short something called "The Master's Tools Cannot Destroy the Master's House," I think, by Audre Lorde. I want to say that's who it is. And part of like, when I read that, one of my takeaways was this idea that I am a white person and it's only white people who can give up white privilege. So we have to start doing that out loud, or else it will never change. The same way that men back 100 years ago had to say, like, I am diluting some of my voting power by giving more people the right to vote, i.e. women. If you are the one with the power, part of your responsibility is to actively give up that power when you need to whatever degree you can. Do you know of any books that discuss racism and sexism, like racism specifically towards women of color? There is a lot and more works about that. One I was going to mention that I really like, going out of frame to grab it, is Eloquent Rage by Brittney Cooper. This is a memoir, but I think that this does a really good job of describing the need for an intersectional feminist identity, where she explains the kind of double bind that Black women find themselves in, where they are never allowed to be first in conversations about race, because of how much state violence is directed towards Black men in particular. There's this real pressure on Black women to not talk about the ways that being a woman in the Black community is difficult. And then in feminist circles, there's this pressure to put your feminist identity above your identity as a Black woman and not be able to talk about how your experience of race as a woman is impacting your feminism. So I think that there's more and more conversation around that. This is one I really like. I think somebody mentioned hood feminism. I've heard that's really good. I've also heard good things about one called White Tears, Brown Scars. I think that author is Australian. So a little perspective outside of the US. But yeah, there's increasingly a lot of discourse talking about that in particular. Bethany recommends, yes, Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion by Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. Yeah, I would also recommend specifically, sorry, just a second. Hi. The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. This is a theology by one of the leading Black liberation theologians that is basically comparing Jesus's execution to lynching, and how that relates to the Black Christian experience in a way that I think is really powerful. So there's increasingly also more and more resources for different religious experiences intersecting with race. Intersectionality, guys, it's such a thing. Oh, there you go. Eloquent Rage by Brittney Cooper. And I need to get back to Rage Becomes Her. I was in the middle of that when I got sick, but I was really enjoying that one too. Oh, and hood feminism. There you go. So yes, there you go. More people shutting down All Lives Matter. Woo! So I've been in one conversation with somebody who earnestly wanted to understand why All Lives Matter was dumb. And I want to engage, and again, this is, to my mind, this is not on Black people to take on this discussion. This is a conversation that white people need to be having with other white people. But in the same spirit as somebody like Natalie Wynn, who I think engages with what are troll questions, but can have an earnest question behind them. I do think it's also good for us to be able to have the earnest answer to this. The earnest answer to why All Lives Matter is dumb is for the same reason why when your kid asks why there isn't a Children's Day if there's Mother's Day and Father's Day, is every day is Children's Day. Every day is White Lives Matter Day. So it's not a question of, the whole point of Black Lives Matter is saying that all lives matter except Black lives so often. That is the entire intention behind that hashtag. So, I do think I have encountered people who have this question honestly, because of ignorance, true ignorance. So I think if dumb questions are asked in good faith, I don't want to troll them back if they're not being a troll, but it is a troll question. And I agree with you, Kay. It is good to see increasingly people just being like, bye. We don't want to even talk about that. Yep. I've not read The Hate U Give, but I mean, man, that was definitely a blockbuster. I know people absolutely love that one. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ursula. That's I guess that's the collection for the essay I was referencing earlier. I should try to find that again. It's been a while since I've read it. What frustrates me during this time is those who are demanding evidence that what happened to George Floyd was rooted in racism. Yeah, and this is why I think having a structural understanding of how racism and power work is so important, because if one is so inclined, one could choose to believe that, oh, this just happened to be a Black guy. But I think if you have an understanding of any of the history of this and any of the context in which this happened, it's just impossible to sincerely think that race had nothing to do with it. And, I think this is where, like, I would say to other people who are not Black, but are part of some kind of marginalized group, like drawing from your own empathetic imagination of times where you have experienced prejudice in some way, and then mapping it onto these situations is helpful, because there are times where I have experienced sexism that I can't prove to you that somebody was sexist or that it came from a misogynistic place. But I have lived in the world as a woman for 32 years and have some level of intuitive understanding or sense of when sexism is involved. So, I mean, it's not a math equation. We can't like prove it. But again, I think it would take a real ignoring of everything that we know about history and structural racism to try to make that argument. I have not read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, but I have heard it's good. I do believe that is specifically speaking to the British context. I could be wrong about that. I've not read it. That's my impression. So just FYI there. Have you read Homegoing? I have not. I have heard mostly good reviews. I saw someone say it's like if you broke a bone, but all bones matter. Yes, but let's deal with the hurt one first. Exactly. And again, it's a troll question. It can be asked in good faith from a place of ignorance, but people who are trolling do not deserve serious answers. Okay. Next up, two books. One that was, I think, that I really recommend in terms of getting to a personal story that is told just beautifully and compellingly, Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi. This is a letter he has written to his son. And this, I think, was fortuitously timed in terms of when it came out. I believe it was happening right when the Black Lives Matter hashtag was getting going. Or, oh, I guess it was a little bit after that. But it was in the wake of some of the more recent high-profile cases in the last few years. Oh, okay, maybe I'm back. Okay, hopefully I'm back. Sorry, I got a spinny circle of death. But I just think that this paints a beautiful, just... Okay, I did pause. Sorry about that. Probably my internet. It's dumb sometimes. But I just think that this really paints a good picture of what it's like to be a Black man and live in the world and be just constantly aware that you can be in the wrong place at the wrong time and be killed for it. So I think this is really good. And I will also say, I think that his essay collection, We Were 8 Years in Power, to me, this wasn't like an all-time favorite, but I do think it does a really good job of summarizing a lot of what we're talking about in these other resources into a really like cogent, clear argument. No, come back. Come back. Okay, sorry. I think it's my internet. Blame Xfinity. They're trying to censor me. Okay, so let me, since apparently I'm having some connection issues, let me move more quickly through the rest of my recommendations. So the next one I want to mention that I think is really relevant to this current moment is a book called A Colony in a Nation by Chris Hayes. And his argument specifically is talking about how Black people in the US are policed as if they were living in a colonized state where the ruling country is policing a group of people that they have subjugated, whereas white people are policed in the more traditional sense of like law enforcement or peacekeeping. I think it's a really good argument. It's a good audiobook. I would recommend that. That is A Colony in a Nation by Chris Hayes. Let's see here. Yeah. To Cappuccino Craft's point, at some point you can see all the evidence, and that's why it's important to have a narrative that explains that evidence in a way that makes sense. The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, that is on my list of what I want to read next. I have heard amazing things, and that's another kind of nonfiction classic I want to get to. What are your thoughts on Confederate statues? I think they have no place being up in public spaces. I think that they should be collected and put into a museum because they are historical, but they don't deserve to be in a public place that confers any kind of approbation or laud to them. And the fact of the matter is they were mostly put up in the 1920s. So most of the arguments about how they are a deep piece of cultural history, that can't be removed from their hallowed place is just something I'm not sympathetic to. Okay. So for a Canadian recommendation, I've been meaning to tell you by David Sharondi, maybe. Sounds like a good compliment to Between the World and Me. I've not heard of that. I'll have to check that out. So we talked about A Colony in a Nation. I already talked about Eloquent Rage. That was the next one up on my list. Okay, March by John Lewis. I think especially if you have teens in your life who you would like to give some history that's very approachable, I think that John Lewis's graphic novel Autobiography is a wonderful way to learn about the civil rights movement and all the major players in it. So I think that this is a really accessible piece of history that I very much recommend. The artwork is beautiful, and I think just as a graphic novel, it works really well. But particularly, I think as an approachable piece of history is a great pick. And then I want to move, this is somewhat to the other side of the coin, but I think you cannot understand Blackness in America without understanding whiteness in America. So part of the American narrative about race is that whiteness is sort of like neutral, or like the vanilla, like the just sort of like default nondescript race. And that is a really harmful assumption because there are specific ideas about what it means to be white. And I think one of the silver linings, it feels like a really weird thing to say, but part of the rise of white nationalism in the last few years, I think, has allowed that fact to become much more visible to people. So 2 books that I want to recommend in terms of thinking about ideas of whiteness and why this particular moment is an increased moment of animus towards Black people on behalf of some white people. 2 books. One is a history called White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America by Nancy Eisenberg. This is a really interesting history of the white underclass that has always existed in America. It's a very compelling read, and I think really helps I want to be careful about how I say this. People who choose to be actively and aggressively racist, like, are wrong and should be not welcome in polite society, and when they break the law should be in jail, like, period, done. I think, though, part of being able to effectively fight these kinds of ideologies is understanding where they come from. And I do think that this does a good job of portraying how white underclasses have been set up since the beginning of the US to place the blame for their problems on Black underclasses instead of on the overclasses. So there you go. So I think that this is a helpful history to contextualize that, and I think helps understand the rhetoric of where racist ideas come from out of white nationalism, and I think suggests some ways to combat them. Whiteness as default. Yes, exactly. Yes, I very much would like the sequel to March. I'm hoping we get it. I hope we get it. I know that Congressman Lewis is a very busy man, but I would like it. The idea that we don't have a culture because our culture is the base or default. Exactly. And we being white culture. Yeah. There's this presupposition that whiteness is the default, is the base culture, and therefore it doesn't have to be like defined or studied or have like an anthropologist lens put on it. Yes, and voting against their interest. That is 100% true. And I could go on a whole tear about how cynically different lobbying groups know that and use it, which was something I learned when I lived in DC. I would be at parties and right-leaning think tank workers would very blatantly admit of how they do that. It was real gross. Speaking of like more contemporary events, things about voting against your own interest, Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl is Jonathan Metzl, actually he's here in Nashville at Vanderbilt. He's a psychologist, and basically he talked about how conceptions of whiteness and holding on to white privilege, it's not only voting against your own interests like from a political aspect, it leads to worse health outcomes for white people than they would have if they did not vote against their own interests, and if they allowed things like Medicaid expansion here in Tennessee. Like the main beneficiaries of a Medicaid expansion in Tennessee would be white people. But rhetorically, because of racist ideas, there is this idea about who gets Medicaid, and therefore it is something that is not supported. Lobbying doesn't sound very democratic. Well, that's a whole, that is a whole other ball of yarn. Not even going to go there. Yes. Yeah, I think Dying of Whiteness, I think it provokes a lot of sadness, because you realize that people are voting against their own interest and acting against their own interest from a place of fear and a very specific idea of what the good life means that materially impacts their actual quality of life. And that is eye-opening and very sad. Okay, and then the last one I wanted to recommend is another history called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. This is fantastic. This is a history of the practice of redlining. And I think what this gets at is how it wasn't just private individuals who enacted the practice of redlining, which, if you don't know, was basically a practice by banks to systematically keep Black people out of specific neighborhoods. And he explains how not only did that happen, it kept Black families, especially Black GIs coming back from World War II, from being able to build up the same kind of equity in housing that their white counterparts were able to, and then were able to pass that wealth on to subsequent generations. So it's not only an inequitable practice in and of itself, it also has led to wealth inequality over the last 80 years. So This I very much recommend. I think it's a really good example of a history done well, very eye-opening, and I think a good example of taking a specific issue and being able to show how history continues to impact us today. So those are books that I have read and recommend. In terms of what I'm reading now and what I might read next, so currently I'm finally listening to The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I'd kind of been putting it off because if you don't know, this is sort of like a new nonfiction classic, and she was really crucial in making the argument that you see kind of blown out more in 13, that documentary from, oh gosh, what's her name? Ava DuVernay, is that her name? This idea that when Jim Crow laws were made illegal as a part of the civil rights movement, increasingly part of how we have been able to systematically oppress Black people, and especially Black men, is by essentially turning our prison system into another way of enforcing oppression, of oppressing Black people through the criminal justice system. I think a related book I'm listening to right now is called Charged by Emily Bazelon. It's not quite as directly, but it's talking about like the need for reform in our criminal justice system. So I'm listening to that one right now. I've been putting it off because it is such a classic and it gets referenced in like all the books we talked about probably will make an allusion to Michelle Alexander at some point in them. So I was afraid it wouldn't live up to my expectations, but so far it's so good. And it's really just like really well argued. I can tell already I'm going to love it. Let's see here. Oh, Emerson, the Crazy Hunger Games is back. Welcome back, Emerson. Let's see here. With this whole issue in reading Animal Farm, it made me sad to think about whoever has power will always use it to abuse it. Will always abuse it and divide culture. I mean, I want to think not always, but like that is the tendency. To follow the color of law, in my TBR is the address book, which also talks about race and neighborhoods and white flight. Okay, I've not heard of that one, but I will make a little note of that one. I do find this whole topic really, really interesting. And I think it also, I mean, I find it interesting, and I also find it very relevant to a lot of ways that we can like practicably change our future. Because if we lived in neighborhoods that were more racially diverse, not just even racially diverse, but also socioeconomically diverse, there's a lot of thinking about that being a key way to improve our future. Okay, sorry. I was making a note in Goodreads. Thank you for that recommendation. Yes, Ava DuVernay. Okay. Let's see here. Chocolate City is a history of race and democracy in DC. Oh, well, okay, guys. You're just giving me recommendations now. Chocolate City. Also, I love that title. Okay, thank you. Ask your librarians to help you find reads about race relations in your own city, town, region. Knowing the history of your own neighborhoods is crucial. I couldn't agree more, Stephanie. That was probably part of what I love so much about March, is that John Lewis got his start in Nashville when he was a student here in college. And I found that so interesting. It made me think about my city in a different way, like different landmarks and stuff. It was, yeah, I think that's absolutely fantastic as a recommendation. Yes, all of these books are going to be in the description box when this goes live. I already typed it up, so they will all be there for your reference. Emerson, I'm not going to talk to you about Hunger Games. I've answered that question so many times for you. So let's see here. What else were we going to talk? Okay, so that's what I'm reading right now. The ones that I'm going to read next. Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by Sabrina Strings. I got that audiobook. And it's about, so this was really interesting, but I did, I think I mentioned I did a paper on Beyonce in grad school, and I was doing some reading about like the history of images of Black women in media, and this idea of like fetishizing Black women's bodies, especially like this idea of like Black women having a larger butt, like bigger boobs, all of that, like that has been around since Roman times. Sorry. Emerson, I totally get that you want to talk about Hunger Games. I just don't think it's appropriate for this topic in this chat. So if you wouldn't mind, you're welcome to stay. But if you wouldn't mind not bringing that up, it's just not the time. Oh, but going back to like, yeah. So anyway, I'm just really interested in that whole idea because that has like really ancient origins. These ideas about like what Black women's bodies are supposed to look like or being fetishized is really interesting to me. So I think that will be really interesting. I also got that recommendation for that book in the context of books about medical, like how the medical system treats Black people differently. So I think it's also talking about like how this perception about fat and Black women, like how that impacts their medical outcomes or their health outcomes. So I think that one is really good. Another one that I'm interested in is one called Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race by Debbie Irving. It's about kind of similar maybe to like White Fragility or whatever, but like sort of an honest exploration of a white woman's confrontation of her own racist assumptions. So I'm interested in that. I've got A Black Woman's History of the United States on hold from the library. That is by Dana Ramey Berry. And I think that it's sort of in the same vein as some of these other like rewritings of US history, like the People's History of the United States or whatever, but it's from the perspective of like Black women in the history of the US. So I've got that as an audiobook hold from the library. And then I've got as an ebook, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Racial Divide by Carol Anderson. I've got that one. I've heard her speak on several podcasts, but I have never read anything by her. And she just seems really rad, and I've heard that book is great. So I'm excited to get to that one. And the last one that's kind of on my radar is Citizen by Claudia Rankine, which I think is sort of more from like a poetic take. I don't know. I'm not even totally sure about this one. I've just heard that it's really great, and I think it's like poetry maybe. So I don't know. If anybody's read that, they can let me know. Let's see here. The Warmth of Other Suns. Oh yeah, that was a big one a few years ago. I think that's about like the migration, like Black migration out of the South into like the Midwest and California, right? I've heard that that's really good. Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that one. I need to get back to that. When you hear me typing, that is me going to Goodreads. Okay. I started listening to White Rage today, and so far it has been amazing. Yeah, I've heard nothing but great things about it. And like I said, I've heard her on a bunch of podcasts, and I feel like she's super rad. I read One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson, and it was a little slow, but really great information. Oh, that's right. I think that one was the one she wrote after White Rage. She's coming out with a new book named Cast. Huh, okay, good to know. Are there any of the books you've recommended that you would suggest on audio specifically? So I'm somebody who tends to prefer these days having my nonfiction on audio. So in general, a lot of these I at least read for the first time on audio. I think A Colony in a Nation works particularly well on audio because Chris Hayes is on MSNBC, so like he's used to reading things well. So he does a good job narrating that one. I think, what other ones did I think work particularly well as audio? Eloquent Rage by Brittney Cooper, because it's in her own voice. So I thought that one worked pretty well. And Stamped from the Beginning. I liked having that as audio because, I don't know, I listened to it, I think twice, like, or at least sections of that I listened to it twice because I liked being able to have it like reprocessed that way. I don't know. That one worked well for me as audio. Some of these, what did I read not as audio? I think Between the World and Me, I didn't listen to as audio, but if Ta-Nehisi Coates were to read it, anytime you can get an audiobook read by the author, often I think that's a great way to go. Moved to DC a year ago from a Midwest suburb, learned more about the inequality of the health system after experiencing a health emergency than I learned in my 32 years as a university professor. Yeah, the disparity in outcomes between white people and Black people in the medical system is like honestly pretty shocking the more you listen to it, or the more you like have your eye open for it. Actually, John Oliver did a nice segment about that maybe like a year ago now. I think it's a good kind of introduction to that. Yes, Stamped from the Beginning is great. Me and My White Supremacy by Layla Saad. Huh. What, Ursula, what is that one about? Besides the US, there's been a few, if you listen back, there's been a few for Canada. Like I said, I think Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, I think that one's in the British context. White Tears, Brown Scars, I think is from an Australian. So, is Langston Hughes a good poet for understanding race issues? I don't know, like, specifically in the same way that these books are, but I mean, he's a brilliant poet and will enrich your life. Yeah, I really like audiobooks. I'm also a lover of podcasts, any kind of, especially in these times when we're all stuck. Well, and I live by myself. I really enjoy having somebody else's voice in the house. So I like an audiobook. Okay, Bethany says that Ta-Nehisi Coates does read that one, so that's good. Yep. Bethany's co-signing on Between the World and Me, and Stamped from the Beginning is audio. Ooh, okay. There's a book that talks about the history of medical disparities, medical apartheid. I've seen that one mentioned, so that's good to know. Okay, thank you, Sherry. I'm going to put that in my Goodreads, because I think that's like the third or fourth time I've seen someone recommend that. Apartheid. If you follow me on Goodreads, you will see a definite theme of things I'm adding tonight here. Okay. Me and White Supremacy is similar to So You Want to Talk About Race. Okay, that's good to know. Ooh, and Medical Apartheid is available as audio from my public library. How convenient. Okay. The Skin We're In by Desmond Cole is a memoir subtitled A Year of Black Resistance and Power, detailing his experience throughout 2016 in Canada as a Black man. Okay, so there's another Canadian recommendation. So there's another shout out for Canada. Okay, yes, John Oliver's segment was called Bias in Medicine, and it's great. It is great. Yeah. Let's see here. Me and White Supremacy is a workbook of writing prompts to explore unconscious and unexamined thoughts and assumptions about race. That's awesome. Okay. Let's see here. It was a project she did on Instagram a couple years ago. She's made them into published resources, but I've heard you can get the PDFs online. Okay, cool. Yes. Oh, okay. Ursula mentions that she's asked that you don't use those PDFs anymore, so look at that. Iron sharpens iron. Real-time updates here. The Kindle version is $2.99 on Amazon right now, so that's great. I think that was all the recommendations that I had, but if other people have ones that I've missed, definitely feel free to speak up as we're starting to wind down here. A couple of other just recommendations. If you're watching this, I'm assuming you are some kind of like person who's interested in BookTube. I would really highly recommend going and following Jessie. And I always get this switched up. Is it Books and Bowties or Bowties and Books? Bowties and Books. They are posting a lot of really great updates on their Instagram stories. They are in Minneapolis and going to protests, and it is hard to watch, but I think they are a creator here on BookTube who just generally is worth following. But specifically right now, if this is something you're interested in and you're interested in supporting and following a booktuber who is actively engaged in protests in Minneapolis, my recommendation would be to go follow Jessie. I think I put their YouTube link in the description already. So that's just another recommendation for a creator here on BookTube. There are so many books, there's so many people who are making recommendations about fiction picks from Black authors, featuring Black characters. If you were at all on the bookish internet, I feel like there's been a lot of those. I definitely commend those posts to you. My friend Bethany, who's been in the chat, she is doing recommendations based on genre. So I think she already put up her romance one. So you can get genre specific recommendations based on what you enjoy. So, that's another way to educate yourself / just read some rad books. So that's another suggestion. Do you have any tips for which books I should read during this time to get my mind off of things? I think, like I said, at the beginning of the cast, I've been doing comfort reads. Nora Roberts is a huge comfort read for me, so I've been digging into her. I think we always have to balance. Like, the human brain has not evolved to take in as much information as we have access to now. It's overwhelming. It's already been a really stressful time with COVID. It's a lot. And there are times where you're going to need to look away, and I think do that, but do it to come back refreshed and ready to be an ally to the degree you can, whatever your circumstances are right now. I know, because a lot of us are still in quarantine, things are a little weird. But, take care of yourself, balance, some comfort reading or relaxation reading with, some more purposeful kind of edifying reading. Another shout out for The Hate You Give and Pride. Yeah. Yes. Jesse's posts are really hard to watch, but they are doing a great job of keeping everybody in BookTube world up to date on what's happening kind of on the ground in Minneapolis. Yes. So Bethany's going to keep making those videos. And, I think a lot of people are doing similar posts. So keep your eyes open for those suggestions. Yes, highly recommend. Follow them on YouTube and Instagram. Great content. I don't know them really beyond to say hi to. I did get to meet them briefly last year at Book Nut Fest. they seem like a lovely person, even beyond the great content that they are putting out right now. And really, I feel like it's a service to the BookTube community, their willingness to post and to share right now. So I really recommend following them. Yeah, Alyssa Cole. Hey, if you need some relaxation, if you need some relaxation right now and you like romance, may I commend, and you want to support Black authors with Black characters, Alyssa Cole, you cannot do better. Followed very closely behind her right now for me is Talia Hibbert, because take a hint, Dani Brown was everything. But until that comes out on the 23rd. But Mating the Huntress, go read Mating the Huntress if you just need like a cinnamon roll hero and who loves that the heroine is like a stabby murderer of bad werewolves. Would you say nonfiction books are better than fiction books to inform me about the current events going on? I would say, I know that there's a lot, like, I know fiction is more accessible. And I do think that it can be really helpful to build kind of what I was talking about of like the head and heart knowledge. I think it can really help with that. But in terms of having like a broader macro systems view of what racism is and what it does, I really do think that engaging with some nonfiction, either in book form or in blog posts, articles, podcasts, is really important. Because I think that's like really important to build kind of your macro level view of what racism is. So I do think that nonfiction in this context is important. I know it's not everybody's thing, but I really do recommend it. Even if you just pick one or two from what we talked about tonight, I think it's great. Bookish Realm and Bree Hill. Yes. I don't watch Bookish Realm, but Bree Hill is so great. If you like romance, please go follow Bree Hill on Instagram, if nothing else. I love her Instagram posts. Yeah, thank you, MF. It's just a heavy time, man. It's a lot, and it's okay. It's okay to not be okay, which I know is a cliche, but rhymes for your nerves. Yes. Yeah, if you were able to get out and protest, and that is something that you are able and moved to do, then, stay safe, stay peaceful. There's a lot of people behind you. I can barely sit for more than 2 hours at a time. So I'm not really in a position to be out protesting these days, but yeah. Rafe by Rebecca Witherspoon. That's also on my TBR. I've heard it's amazing. Yes, that he's a total cinnamon roll. Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, which I think just won, was it the Pulitzer Prize? I think one of the big book prizes last year. An American Marriage by, I can't remember. And The Yellow House. So those are all more fiction recommendations. Let's see here. I love The Sidewalk is My Bed, about the race issues and homelessness, but has redemption with a bittersweet ending. Well, there you go. I would like the Bookish Realm. Okay, I'll have to check them out. So anyway, I think that's most of what I wanted to share. I know this was a heavier one, but it's a heavy time, man. I guess I will end by saying, so like I mentioned, John Lewis started his career here in Nashville, leading student protests. And on our public library, there's this big quote from him, and it says, "If not us, then who? And if not now, then when?" And, sorry, I almost made it through this without my white woman tears, but I just love, like, what I love about that is I think there's this perception of like, this is for other times. Like it's other people's responsibility to fix things, and we all feel small. And like we can't change things. And most individuals don't have the chance to change the world, but we do have the opportunity to influence people around us. We have the opportunity to do what is right in our day-to-day lives, to educate ourselves, to hold other people in our lives accountable. Like, we can do those things. And if everybody does those things, things will change. So especially to my fellow non-Black people, like, kind of to use a biblical allusion here, have the eyes to see and the ears to hear injustice, racism, hatred around you towards Black people, especially now, but all the time. Like, I think if we have the eyes to see it happening, we will see it. And I think part of what I like about these resources is that they made me feel like in the moment when I see things happening, I feel like I at least have some idea of how to respond. I was mentioning earlier, like, some of the sort of verbal tactics you can take, but also just like, it made me aware of, like, when I'm out shopping, like, especially in these times, if I see, a fellow shopper who's Black and it's mostly white people, like, I kind of just keep my eyes out for them and make sure that nobody's giving them a hard time. And like, I've thought through, like, if I saw somebody being harassed, what would I do? Like, even just things like that. If you feel like you kind of have a plan, you have awareness of the people around you, and you're willing to put your money where your mouth is, and, when you see things, call them out and stand up for people who need support in difficult situations. Like, it's not, again, you individually probably aren't going to get the chances to change the world, but if we all had that mindset, I think it's just a nicer place to live if we have the mindset of looking out for the people around us. But B, I do think things will change eventually. I really, I tend to be more Pollyanna about this, but I really do believe that the arc of history bend towards justice. I do believe that it is better to be Black, better to be a woman, better to be gay, better to be any number of other minority groups in 2020 than it was in 2010, and then it was in 2000, and then it was in 1990. Like, it is slow change, but we do see change. And I think if we continue, to work in our communities, I have to believe that things can change slowly and painfully, but hope is powerful. So that's my exhortation for the evening. I see a lot of people saying good night. So good night. Yes, if enough people do something, it does add up. Yes, thank you, Bethany. Do not call the cops on Black children. Please don't. You know what? During the unrest on Saturday, a couple of kids vandalized my mailbox. Boo freaking who? Like, it's not that big of a deal. I didn't need to call the police for that. So I did not. Putting out recommendations for Black booktubers to support, to link in the description. I mentioned specifically Jesse from Bow Ties and Books, so shout out to them especially. But so many people are posting recommendations. Bree Hill, Steph talks romance or loves romance. There's so many great Black booktubers. We could go on and on. Yes, let's keep it going. I agree, Kay. Let's all start speaking out. Thank you, KR. Yes, thank you. Okay, so I think that probably does it. I'm exhausted, honestly. Even just having to think this through is exhausting. So imagine the people who are doing the hard work out in the streets. So send them your love, your prayers, educate yourself, donate if you can. Keep it going. 2020 will end eventually, and hopefully maybe it will end slightly more just than it began. I don't know. Maybe that's too much to hope, but fingers crossed. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yes. It is okay to cry. I agree. You go, Adele. You give them hell. That whole thing with St. John's, We aren't even going to go there. Okay. You guys are great. I hope you stay safe. Have a wonderful evening. I will see you guys back here next Tuesday, possibly for lighter talk. I don't know. Who knows what's going to happen between now and next Tuesday? Maybe we're going to have to talk about like nuclear war. Who even knows? Okay. Love you guys. Bye.